Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Thursday, November 14th, 2019. Time for yet another show. I don't know if you noticed yesterday, but apparently they tried to get started on impeaching President of the United States. So that was kind of interesting. We didn't get to see it very much because they started in the middle of the show. Very inconsiderate, very rude, really. Honestly, I think there's somebody, maybe I see if I can talk to somebody. I want to talk to a manager about what happened here. See if we can get these things rescheduled. Having it on a Wednesday is not a great idea, of course, because it tends to take Joan McCarter away from us. But there are no hearings today, so we'll be able to catch up with what happened. As you know, we'll be responsible, I guess, for providing our own pizzazz. It's BYOP-IZZAZZ. It's a great word, really, spelling pizzazz. It's you can't believe you've got it right once you've written it down. But apparently, I don't even know where that came from, but everyone was passing that around today. I guess one of the news analyses of what happened yesterday, judging them as interesting to some extent, but mostly repeating the same information that we already had from the depositions. That, of course, is what happens with depositions. Depositions are taken ahead of time so that you basically know what will be said later on. But of course, that's actually at the trial stage, and this isn't the trial stage. Okay, fine. We're having the grand jury stage at this point. Sometimes the proceedings can be a little bit boring, but they say they lacked pizzazz, or they were questioned anyway, whether they had enough pizzazz to capture the public's interest. There was, of course, some new information yesterday. I had to turn them on yesterday. There was no avoiding them. Literally, if you turned them on any of the major networks, they were all covering it, so it was very difficult to avoid. But I actually wanted to see some of this stuff. And it was very easy, and even if I was away from the television, I found that it was pretty simple to find on a smartphone. So I think a lot of people were probably able to follow the developments relatively well yesterday. So we'll see where the pizzazz was, or whether it captured everyone's imagination or not. Of course, on the other hand, as was pointed out, the analysts were making a guess as to what they thought about the pizzazz and what the public thought about it. Offered up, as usual, as expert opinion. But Eric Boehlert pointing out quite wisely this morning that there's no way that they know what public opinion is on this stuff. From listening to Greg, you got to wait. You got to measure public opinion and then come back with data. And there was simply no way for there to be comprehensive long-term data just yet. Although, in days past, as I pointed out this morning, they used to do snap polling during the debates. They would have people watch the debates and actually poll them during the debates and have people call in, or I don't remember exactly what the mechanism is, but you could give your thumbs up, thumbs down, who won the debate instantly in a new product that they briefly rolled out and called snap polling. And of course, my recollection is that it showed in real time, live on the air, that the experts who just told you what the public thought about who won the debate were wrong, and the public actually thought the exact opposite. And then I thought a very mature response to that was to stop doing snap polls. Don't show that our experts are wrong. Don't serve as a lesson to our experts. Not to jump out ahead of the public and pretend you know what they're thinking if you really don't, but instead, please let us not show up the experts live on the air. We could do it later, I suppose. But anyway, no snap polling, I guess, available for the events yesterday. The new news was somewhat interesting. We'll round all of that up. Now, of course, time to let you know that Daily Coast Radio is live. That's what all this nonsense has been about. What does Bill have to say this morning? Well, in fairness, this irregular radio program is not as outlandish as it could be. But at least Kagro X, me, David Waldman, has the courtesy to congratulate you for passing your Star Chamber auditions in the basement. Yes, congratulations. I see right here the second tweet from Bill is do not congratulate. So I guess I may have overstepped my boundaries on that one. Let's see. Oh, as for the new information yesterday, if I've got it right, Ambassador Taylor let people know that a staffer, was it his staff? I don't know what they were doing. If I got it right, he has a staffer or a State Department staffer apparently overheard a conversation initiated by Gordon Sondland. Do I have this right? I'll check in with Greg in just a minute. But a conversation initiated by Ambassador Sondland from, as I understand, from a restaurant in Kiev, which is not a good place for doing something like this. Yes, and Abby was at that restaurant. That's true. And it's all right. We don't mind if she joins in the conversation. Or at least we don't want to drive you crazy trying to stop her anyway. But he calls President Trump. And this, I wonder if this was, I don't know if this was the conversation of finding out whether or not I'm supposed to admit to there being a quid pro quo. But in this, I can't imagine there were that many conversations between Trump and Sondland. But at any rate, during this one, he says, make it clear, look, no quid pro quo, no quid pro quo. He's been instructed, apparently, to make sure that he says that on the record so that people think, oh, I heard that, no quid pro quo. So there isn't one, even though there is. But apparently the conversation was loud enough and unsecure enough that the staffer was able to overhear even Trump's part of the conversation coming out of Sondland's cell phone, which is not a smart thing to do in a restaurant in Kiev, for one thing. And of course, has been pointed out by late afternoon, he called him on his personal unsecure cell phone, which Kiev is pretty well wired, and pretty much anything that you do in an unsecured setting is guaranteed to be listened in on by the Russians and probably the Ukrainians, and I guess whoever's eating lunch with you as well. So that was a new bit that they brought up. I guess that information wasn't available to Taylor when he testified the first time. So the big shocker was, oh, by the way, outside corroboration from somebody who actually was not on the call between Trump and Sondland, but heard it nonetheless, says, oh, guess what? Pretty much everything we said was exactly right. So I don't think the Republicans knew exactly what to do with that one.
Well, what's the point of having a secure phone anyway, Kiev or otherwise?
Yes.
If you're going to put the president on speakerphone and blast it out in the restaurant so that the Israelis, the Saudis, and the Kyrgyzstanis also know what's going on.
I'm not sure. Was it on speakerphone or was
I don't
it
know,
just...
but I mean, they said Trump was talking loud enough so you could hear it.
Right. Well, if you say it loud enough, as you know, it sounds precocious. So that's what he was doing. I thought it was he's just a loud-voiced guy and it leaks out from around your ear. Or maybe it was so loud that Sondland held it away from his head.
But it was definitely Mr. Butterfield, are you saying that there are tapes kind of moment?
Yeah, well, and so there were. Well, there's tapes. We should just tape Abby and just play that in regular day, even when she's not upset at what's going on. How are the walkways going?
Well, they're here.
Yeah, all right, I guess so. Look, so they're on time.
They're in the middle of building a wall, so it's 20 degrees, but they still mix cement and throw stones around, so it's kind of nice.
That's
Abby just got so she can go bark at them.
Okay, well, go ahead. It's a free comment period.
As a matter of fact, Abby's comments were very pertinent because there were two aspects of the hearing yesterday.
Yes.
Hearings. I don't know. Do you always use hearings, plural, for a hearing? But the what we heard. Hearsay hearings.
Yes.
What we heard is one side very serious about trying to get to the facts. And this is one of the facts that was uncovered in the process of doing that.
Yes.
And the other was jumping up and down on the table and making a lot of noise.
Oh, yeah, that was a lot of it. That was good.
Evan Nunes started off because he's the ranking member of the group who's doing this hearing and his was kind of silly. It was all conspiracy theory. Everybody's part of this deep state, this, that, and everything, which is really tough to do with George Kent and Bill Taylor, the two guys that were testifying.
The deepest.
Well, George Kent wears a bow tie, so he's obviously serious. So that's not going to fly. I mean, and if you're going to say people with bow ties are the deep state, how do you explain Tucker Carlson? So, that just doesn't go over. The other side is probably the most effective, and I use that in scare quotes, presentation was Jim Jordan's, which has a shelf life because what he said is it's all hearsay.
Yes.
And the problem with it being all hearsay, of course, is the next point that the Democrats make is, well, the reason it's hearsay is because Trump is blocking all the people who are actually there on the conversation. Why don't you have those people in?
That's true, too.
And there was one very funny moment, I think it was Peter Welch on the Democratic side, where Jordan was complaining about we need to get the person who is in the center of this that started all of this. And he was trying to make the case that the whistleblower needs to testify in public, which is, of course, something that would reveal his identity and wouldn't go down well. And Peter Welch laughed and said, well, you're right. We need to have the person who started this in the first place testify so we can see what's going on and what's at the bottom of it. Why don't we have Mr. Trump tomorrow?
Yeah, that would be a day.
And that kind of shut down that part of the discussion. But it was a very unserious. As a matter of fact, this is Jonathan Bernstein's take on it. Democrats get better at making their impeachment case. One side took a serious approach aimed at persuading the undecided. The other doubled down on conspiracy theories and debunked claims. So that's pretty much what happened. And as I was following this in real time, I took some screenshots, some photographs, if you will, in old speak.
I will.
Of some of the headlines and how it was playing. I'll give them to you as I describe them. This is from the Washington Post. Kent, that's George Kent, helps Democrats debunk GOP theories. George Kent, the top Ukrainian expert, testified there's no evidence Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election and compared Joe Biden and Trump's pressure on Ukrainian officials. This one is from Politico, and it's a big dramatic headline. Black background, white lettering. Taylor reveals new Trump comments about Biden impeachment hearing highlights. This was from the New York Times, and the headline is impeachment testimony. Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden.
That was the conversation.
That was the conversation. So, that stuff gets out there. Update, Taylor says his aide heard Trump asking about Ukraine inquiry. Diplomat reveals call between Trump and second envoy over Ukraine. So the theater criticism this morning that you were referring to, which basically says there wasn't enough pizzazz, they really should have done a dramatic reading, except when Adam Schiff did that, everybody yelled at him. So we want theater. We just don't want that theater. It's kind of dumb. But that's basically what they were doing. And the Washington Post had banner headlines yesterday. Trump sought status of Ukrainian investigations in scare quotes, diplomat says. My point here is that nobody watched the hearings. We'll see what kind of ratings they get. But that's not the point. People hear about the hearings. And they talk about it over the water cooler, the proverbial water cooler that doesn't exist anymore. But they meet in the break room for coffee. And Keurig, over the Keurig, right? And they talk about these headlines, and people get their news from the headlines. They turn on Yahoo to look at something else, and they see the banner come up, and this is what they're hearing. And they're not hearing Jim Jordan complain that it's all hearsay. That's not what's in the news. So that's not what the public's going to hear. And there's nothing wrong with theater criticism that basically says, okay, well, this is the optics of how this went and how the Democrats can adjust. They have a day to do that because the next testimony is tomorrow from Ambassador Yovanovitch. But what does come across is the seriousness of purpose, hardly a witch hunt, new information, further leads, and that's all good. And the funny thing is, and I just find this incredibly amusing, is the White House thinks it was a great day for them. Everybody's looking at this and saying, this is really devastating, presentation here. Plus, there's more info to follow. And all this tells us is that Sondland actually, who's testifying next week, is going to be a big deal because he's going to corroborate that phone call. And the White House is thinking, this is a great day for us because there wasn't anything new that we didn't otherwise know about. And I'm thinking, these guys in the White House aren't very smart to begin with. And if they think this is good for them, I wonder what their definition is of bad for them.
I don't know, but I bet we'll have a chance to find out.
And that's the thing, this is just like day one. So I was interested in some of the commentary back and forth about, what are the optics and how does this look and what does it all mean? In the absence of snap polls, let's predict what the public is going to do, all the stuff you talked about in the intro. And, there's some good arguments that, look, journalism is history at the moment, so it's okay to look at those things and ask those questions. But my argument, and those of many others, is that it's just too early. That, you can ask the question of how is this hitting the public, but don't try to answer it without data. Do you have polling? Do you have Nielsen ratings? Do you have anything? Do you have diner interviews in Pennsylvania from Trump support? I mean, how do you even go about trying to guess how the impact of this is going to be? What do? You talk to your other reporters in the press room and then ask the White House for comment, and that's your story? I mean, that's everything that's wrong with how horse race journalism covers events, policy, and politics. It's just terrible coverage. But we're going to get a lot of it because the Chuck Todds of the world want you to know how you should take this, that nothing's going to change and no Republicans are going to move. Because after all, a procedural vote that happened in the House that is always along party lines was along party lines. You see, I'm right. I got you. I have all the data.
Yes, well,
it's incredibly frustrating when you watch it. But, what's not frustrating is watching the actual hearings and looking at the headlines. What's frustrating is listening to some of the not so good analysts trying to explain to you that they already know the future.
Well, that's what they're supposed to be there for, and I suppose they would like to justify their paychecks.
I mean, this is one of those situations where the legal analysts are saying, wow, this is big. And the political analysts are saying, I don't know, it didn't have pizzazz.
I guess. Although I will say for the brief time that I spent watching some of the analysts during breaks, I flipped over to NBC while I had a television available just to see, all right, well, what does Chuck Todd and the rest of them have to say about things during the breaks? That's kind of
tell me
important.
what you saw. I'll tell you what I saw because it was pretty interesting.
Well, the portion I saw actually was actually pretty well covered. I thought they were pretty careful. For instance, every once in a while somebody would say, well, they looked at the transcript, and then they would pause and say, well, it's not really a transcript. And then, okay, points for that. Good for you to bring that up. And a few other things like that, correcting technicalities. I thought Chuck Todd, at the portion I watched, although then I saw people getting disappointed with him again.
Did you see him on with Andrea Mitchell?
I did, and it seemed to me like
she was great.
Yeah, her comment that struck me was when they were talking about, they keep saying that Zelensky says he wasn't pressured. Well, of course he's not going to say he was pressured. He's in the middle of a pressure campaign being waged against him, in which he fears he's going to lose his ability to defend his country, and he's not going to use an appearance at the UN in the same room next to Trump to criticize Trump when he thinks he's on the verge of getting what he wanted. The way she said it was, if you see him see video of the appearance where he says, oh no, there was no pressure, I was never pressured, it looks like a hostage video. And I thought, wow, all right, good. I'm glad you noticed, because they're just pointing to it.
There was that point in the conversation where Todd said something along the lines of, well, but this is just going to make everybody draw the lines that they're already in and nothing's going to change. And Andrea Mitchell said, actually, the testimony today was new information, and it was pretty devastating.
Well,
and,
all right,
good. Okay, well, thank you.
I'm glad you
That's
did.
the right way to look at it.
It's funny because during the portion I watched, Chuck Todd seemed to be reacting appropriately. He seemed to be genuinely, disturbed at what was being aired and how do you get around this. But I guess maybe he got something in the earpiece. Republicans are turning off they're switching to Fox. Oh, all right, hold on.
Yeah, something along those lines. Anyway, so I also think even for ourselves, it's a little bit too early to pontificate about what the impact of this is going to be. But I will say that it was a pretty coherent, well put together story. I think that the criticism that I saw that I think is most on point is that they could and should do a little bit better job of simply telling the story about what did the president do and why was it wrong.
Okay.
I don't think there was enough of that.
All right.
okay, whether it's Adam Schiff in the beginning or at the end summing up, I think what they did establish is that Ukraine's important for American foreign policy. It matters. The Russians are trying to invade the country. We stand against that. And with democracies, and that may not mean a lot to you because you yourself aren't Ukrainian, but on a world scale, this matters to America. I think they made a pretty good case. The two diplomats did. After all, that's their job.
Right. That's the
of
point.
Trying to explain why that's important to Americans. Now, I don't expect that since most people didn't watch the hearing, I don't expect that that's somehow going to convince the public. But the seriousness of purpose and even the small clips that they showed on the evening news was enough to say, okay, this is a big matter. People are paying attention. The networks are canceling their daily shows in order to cover this. So something's going on. And even if I'm going to turn the TV off in disappointment because I'd rather watch Days of Our Lives or whatever, and it's not on, I want to at least look at the headline tomorrow and see what was this all about, because I'm not going to spend my day watching this. And that part of it, I think, was constructed well. I think the beginning of the story was crafted well in terms of why it matters, and this is what happened. There was, in fact, a separate shadow government operation sanctioned by Donald Trump directly to him, which was bad for American interests. I think they established that yesterday. But I don't think that the bribery and extortion part of it was clear enough in terms of what we're saying the president did is this, and this is why this is bad. So I think that's what they're going to have to clean up on Friday.
Well, that may be.
But it's early.
It
I mean,
reminded me that the Republican counsel, when it was his turn to do questioning, was, I don't know, at least among the people I talked, obviously we weren't going to have a very favorable review of what he did, but he really dropped the ball.
He reminds me of the Kavanaugh hearings where they had an expert in there and then decided they didn't like the expert, and so they sort of cut them off and did their own questioning.
Well, they did. He did a terrible job, and I think part of the reason that he did a terrible job, and part of the reason that, for instance, you think that the foundation for the broader understanding of the crime might not have been established yesterday, is the two witnesses that they had were only able to speak to a very specific part of the picture, which was favorable for laying the foundation, perhaps, of some testimony coming up later for the Democrats, but for the Republicans, it was totally useless.
Well, not just useless. It was
damaging.
worse than that for them. I mean,
Yes.
Don't forget what the counsel did for the 45 minutes, which seemed like 9 hours that he was asking questions.
Yeah.
After Daniel Goldman, the Democratic counsel, had established what's going on here, then it's his turn. And here is his approach to establishing the fact that there was back channel stuff that really wasn't kosher and that it shouldn't have been happening. And Giuliani and Mulvaney and Pompeo and Trump, in the end, were responsible for it. So their counter is, so now it's my turn to question you. What about this crazy theory about Ukraine being responsible for trying to interfere with the 2016 election on behalf of Hillary Clinton? And basically the diplomat said, I never heard of that.
Yeah.
I didn't know anything about that. That's kind of crazy talk.
Right.
And so he shifted gear and he said, okay, that's not going anywhere. What about Hunter Biden? Did you know Hunter Biden was involved in, and what about Hunter Biden? By the way, did I mention Hunter Biden? Let me tell you about Hunter Biden. Do you know anything about Hunter Biden? Did you know that Hunter Biden was part of Burisma? Are these things anything to do with Hunter Biden? What about Hunter Biden? And he did that for about 30 minutes. And so the White House was very happy because they got Hunter Biden in there.
Right. I mean,
now,
that
the diplomat said, I know he was there. I didn't think it looked good, but I have absolutely no information anything actually wrong was happening.
Yeah.
Oh.
Right.
And that's when Devin Nunes then got to talk and said, I yield my time to Jim Jordan.
Yeah, a lot of yielding of time to Ratcliffe, apparently a trusted questioner.
Right, Ratcliffe did a terrible job. I mean, Jordan was the only one who actually had a soundbite that you could use later, which if you didn't see the whole thing would make it sound like he was asking a question. He was trying to establish that it's all hearsay. But again, the problem with that the Democrats have, to counter that is fine. Then you'll agree to have all of these other people testify. Have Pompeo in. Have Milk Mulvaney in. You say it's hearsay. What did Mulvaney say and do?
Yes.
We were told that in a public hearing that the the budget office held up these funds, and that the funds were held up because they wanted an investigation. We've established that. If you think that's hearsay, why don't you have Mick Mulvaney in here tomorrow testifying what happened? That's not hearsay. That's not secondhand. And if Trump blocks that, then your argument about hearsay goes out the window. So all the lawyers are looking at this and saying, that's crazy. That doesn't make any sense at all. And the White House is congratulating themselves because they think they did a great job running rings around the lawyers.
Yes. Well, they're sure they did a great job. And, of course, also after, I guess now months of complaining that the whistleblower's testimony is all hearsay, the one procedural motion that the Republicans were able to come up with was, let's subpoena the whistleblower who has all this invalid testimony to give us. And, you know.
So that was kind of fun for you procedure people, since we have a minute before the break.
Yes.
So what happens here, Adam Schiff said, I'm not giving you this in front of the cameras. You want this procedure vote about whether we should subpoena the whistleblower, but I'm not going to let you posture in front of the cameras for this. So we'll let the witnesses say what they have to say, and then after they're done, I promise you we'll have a short break, then we'll have this procedure vote that you asked for because that's the proper thing to do and I'm a gentleman. And he whispers, after the cameras are off. Okay, so that's what happens. So then that is delayed. I suppose, I don't know if it's Robert's Rule of Order or he just has the power to do it because he has the gavel, but that vote is put off. And then when the vote is taken, okay, it's really confusing because the way it's phrased is they make a motion to subpoena the whistleblower, and then I guess somebody else makes a motion to table it. Yeah. Then they vote on it, and all you hear is all the Democrats say aye.
Right.
And you hear the Republicans say nay, so it sounds like the Democrats are the affirmative party.
Yeah.
And they just change. I suppose that happens all the time. Claire McCaskill was explaining that's the way you do it. But all the soundbite that they got out of it is the Democrats were voting, yeah, let's do this.
Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Networks Radio, and we are without Greg. It was a short segment again today. You know, there's lots of work going on over at the our adjunct studios, our remote studios, and we're gonna get some pictures, I understand, of the construction going on there as well. There's as we found out yesterday, pathways, or was it yesterday? The day before, Monday. Pathways being constructed. No, day before yesterday was Tuesday. So we found out Monday, maybe yesterday. Yeah, yesterday we found out. I was speculating. Stonemasons, when they come around my place, stonemasons are building patios. There's no patio going in, I don't think, but walkways, pathways, and a wall. That's right. He's building the wall. And it's pretty low, probably not 30 feet high, not topped with spikes or anything like that. So, you know, it's a wall we can get along with. And besides which, no, look at this. All right. Looks like they're making progress too. Just so you all know, the pathway is laid out nicely. The tamped down stones that we heard going in. There's some nice, what is that? Slate, like flagstone going down as well. And, oh boy. Oh, I guess the stone saw must be, coming up next. So that'll be causing plenty of, uproar, I'm sure. And then I see is the foundation of the wall. It's all very nice looking. And we thank you for the update, Greg. And so that, there's a lot of curiosity about what is bluestone. Okay, now is bluestone, is that the big flat, wide stones that you're paving with, or is it's bluestone? I know that crushed bluestone is what they put down underneath is the foundation, and then they tamp that down. But it is, I guess, uncrushed whole natural state bluestone, what goes up on top. Okay. Got it. All right. I don't know. I remember, I think my parents built something years ago. So from like 45 years ago, flagstone was the thing. And I don't know what that means. And sounds like a character from Fred Flintstone's Quarry, maybe. But anyway, I got no idea. Belgian block lining. That too I remember. Yeah, those are the granite. Well, what would they be? They're it's in the the three-dimensional. They're rectangles, but they're three-dimensional. Are they? I don't remember what you call those. Rhomboid. Anybody remember? Mathematicians on hand. I gotcha. Belgian blocks lined at the end. That went on the side of the driveway in my parents' project way back when. So okay, I remember a few of those terms. Okay, very good. I'm sure it'll come out nicely. And it'll be brilliant looking and encourage people to find a quid pro quo in the president's dealings. All right. So let's see. We left off just before the break talking about the procedural vote. We may have bled over a little bit into the break, but just to be sure that you got everything that Greg actually said to me, and we'll have it in the podcast anyway. I think I can edit things so that it comes through. But yes, what happened was that the Republicans were looking, for whatever reason, to subpoena the whistleblower, and I think that was, largely, they probably even thought, knowing that it was hearsay evidence or at least that they accused the whistleblower of having only second and third hand knowledge of things, and so therefore that their testimony was going to be mostly hearsay. They may have hoped to bring them in to, well, one, to expose their identity, and two, to yell at that person for having only hearsay evidence. That might have helped them to some extent. But chiefly, I think they just wanted to try and make the person appear and make it look like they were hiding from public view because reasons. And therefore, they could say, well, the reason they're hiding from public view is they're lying, and that's why we don't trust this person. But they didn't get their vote. They instead got a vote on the question of whether or not to table the motion to issue this subpoena. So what they were doing was, the vote that you got to see on television was them voting on whether or not to table it. Tabling it, of course, just means essentially setting it aside, killing it, putting it back on the table where they allegedly put all these written motions and just keeping it there. So they kind of explained it on NBC when I watched. But yes, the effect of it is that all the Democrats are voting the word aye, or voting in the affirmative, and the Republicans end up voting in the negative. And if you're not paying close attention, it looks like the opposite then is the way people feel about subpoenaing that particular witness. So it didn't go over well. Also, I guess Republicans forgot, or, well, they may not have forgotten, but they just didn't care and just wanted to pontificate. But they tried to make some points during debate on the motion to table, which Schiff reminded them pretty quickly is non-debatable. That's one of the things that makes it so handy. You say, I want to make a motion to subpoena this witness. That sounds like something you'd like to talk about. However, I make a motion to table the motion to issue that subpoena. Motions to table are non-debatable, and so that's the end of the debate. And now we have to just go to the voting. So it was, adeptly handled there. I thought that went over. I don't know how that was perceived. I don't know whether anybody really cared because it's procedural and they just didn't understand it. And then sure enough, the reporters came on to tell you in no uncertain terms that you couldn't possibly have understood it. And I will tell you what it means. And they gave the most basic possible sort of explanation. But okay, more or less, they got the idea across. All right. So this cell phone call, I do want to go over to the Washington Post reporting on this thing just to be sure I got the details right. So in case you're sleuthing this out at home, I don't give you any wrong information, or I will only give you the wrong information that the Washington Post wants you to have, I guess. Ambassador's cell phone call to Trump from Kiev. How are we pronouncing that these days? I know we always had Kiev, and now they've changed the spelling, which is, I think, supposed to hint at a different pronunciation. Is it Kyiv? Is that how we're doing it? Kyiv. Kyiv. I can understand why. If that's the pronunciation of it, I could see how we ended up with a poor transliteration that made us think it was Kiev. But I don't know. Ukrainians chime in on that one. Not guilty Ukrainians who are under indictment. Don't need to talk to you. Ambassador's cell phone call to Trump from Kiev restaurant. Not the Kiev restaurant, but a restaurant in Kiev, an actual in the city. It was a stunning breach of security, former officials say. So I hope that this will give us the background on the operational security failures involved in this. But I hope it will also give us some information on the content of the call and the dynamics of how it went down. Ellen Nakashima wrote this piece for the Post yesterday. A U.S. ambassador's cell phone call to President Trump from a restaurant in the capital of Ukraine this summer was a stunning breach of security, exposing the conversation to surveillance by foreign intelligence services, including Russia's, former U.S. officials said. The call, in which Trump's remarks were overheard by a U.S. embassy staffer in Kyiv, and that would make sense, that if it's a U.S. embassy staffer, that would be a Taylor staffer. He's the ambassador. So it was overheard by this staffer. It was disclosed yesterday by the acting U.S. ambassador. Oh, I'm sorry. The acting. Yes, the acting U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, William B. Taylor Jr., on the dramatic opening day, not lacking in pizzazz at all, of public impeachment hearings into alleged abuse of power by the president. All the bases are covered there. The lawyers are happy with it. Mad Hatter, timeout, says Kyiv. Is that right? I heard Greg say that, and it didn't really stick with me. But yes, I think one of the great values of watching on television yesterday was getting pronunciations. That's true. And Athena follows up by saying the ambassador pronounced it as Kyiv. Phonetic spelling. Okay, that's Keeve, Kyiv, phonetic spelling. All right, gotcha. Mad Hatter's is just Keev. So, okay, I think they're both phonetically the same. Ukrainians prefer that from what was reported yesterday, Kyiv. Why couldn't we come up with a transliteration of that? Why does it have to, maybe Russia's, in Russian, it's Kiev or something closer to that. Kyiv, huh? That's a dumb name. I don't like it. It's putting you Ukrainians on notice, Kyiv. All right, like Christopher Reeve, capital Kyiv. Meredith. Oh, thank you. A new voice, a charming voice, chiming in. Kyiv, as in key. Ev is the Russian pronunciation. Kiev. There we go. Now we have a real answer. Thank you. What a great audience we have. Kiev, Russian pronunciation. Kyiv, Ukrainian pronunciation. Preferred by Ukrainians. Well, we certainly want to give them the ability to get their preferred pronunciation. And that's mine too. If I'm trying to figure out how to pronounce something, I like to know how it's pronounced by people who say it every day and whose capital it is. Okay, Kyiv. We'll have to work on that. And yeah, we could still use some work on the transliteration here. But I think people would be very confused, particularly now. People are just getting used to the Kyiv, which isn't Kyiv in my mind, but somehow it's more evocative of, oh, they must mean Kiev, that place that I learned how to pronounce from the Russians when it was a Soviet town. But if you just put Kyiv, like however you chose to spell it, Keev, Keve, I don't know. It sounds like a radio station on the West Coast. But that would just confuse people. People would say, "What? I don't know what the hell that is." So, okay, got it. Kyiv. There were a couple of players in the dealings there too, where they were talking about some of the Ukrainian parties to the conversations whose names were pronounced other than the way I had guessed them along the way. And I said, I should make a mental note of that so I don't make that mistake again. That part I remember. The pronunciation I do not. But Gordon Sondland, but Ambassador Taylor's testimony, that was probably the most overlooked value of all of it. Was a great pronunciation guide, provided he's got it right, and you assume he would, because he is, after all, acting ambassador there. Okay, so back to the story. The call in which Trump's remarks were overheard by a U.S. embassy staffer in Kyiv. Shoo, that much I remember. Now, how could you forget after a discussion that long? Was disclosed Wednesday by the acting ambassador to Ukraine, William B. Taylor. Just putting the shoe on the other foot for a little while. On the dramatic opening day, yes, of the impeachment hearings into the alleged abuse. The member of my staff could hear President Trump on the phone, asking U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland, why was he even in Kyiv, about, quote, the investigations, Taylor testified, referring to the president's desire for a probe of the son of Trump's potential political opponent in 2020, Joe Biden, and the Ukrainian energy company on whose board Hunter Biden once served. I think you knew that. Sondland, Taylor said, told Trump in that conversation that the Ukrainians were ready to move forward on the investigations. The U.S. Embassy staffer who overheard the call, political counselor David Holmes, is scheduled to testify Friday, tomorrow, before House impeachment investigators in a closed session. I like the use of the formal use of it, before the House impeachment investigators. Before they what? Before they leave? No, just in front of them. Got it. The security ramifications are insane. And if you're from the New York area and old enough to remember, we have to say the security ramifications are insane, which is the old Crazy Eddie commercials. And look it up. Google it. And then send me, okay, boomer. And stop mistaking me for a boomer. I'm not. That's not fair. I'm just the oldest of Generation X, as it turns out. Anyway, the security ramifications are insane. It's true. Using an open cell phone, unsecure cell phone, to communicate with the President of the United States, said Larry Pfeiffer, a former senior director of the White House Situation Room and a former chief of staff to the CIA director. In a country that is so wired with Russian intelligence, you can almost take it to the bank, Rusbank, if you want to, Alpha Bank even. You can almost take it to the bank that the Russians were listening in on the call. The whole restaurant was, because it was that loud. Didn't even have to be using electronic means. Which reminds me, the Democrats may be wasting their time trying to subpoena all these people only to have them defy the subpoenas that they send if they are White House loyalists. What we need to be doing is having lunch next to Rudy Giuliani or some of the other insiders in all of this, and just the president eventually will call them and spill the beans and we'll hear it. You don't need to be an electronic snoop. Although, quite honestly, the fact that they're using unsecure cell phones does raise the possibility that maybe electronic snooping wouldn't be such a bad idea. There are legal difficulties with it, but, maybe saving the country might possibly be worth it. I don't know. And there are ways to drag out your prosecution such that you don't land in jail. But if they're using unsecure cell phones, people are going to find out about it, particularly if they're doing so in Kyiv. The impromptu Sondland-Trump conversation took place a day after an official call, July 25th, between Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. They've dropped the second Y in the spelling in most places, and I'm wondering, for Ukrainian pronunciation experts, whether you can tell me whether that has any bearing on how are we pronouncing it. Is Zelensky not how a Ukrainian would say it? All right, just wondering. Anyway, you know all about that call. This took place the day after the infamous call, right? Zelensky at that time was eager to secure a White House visit. We know about that. The Trump-Zelensky call and the pressure on authorities in Kyiv to conduct investigations could aid Trump's 2020 campaign are at the heart of the investigations that could aid the campaign are at the heart of the impeachment hearings. So did I not skip a word there? I can't tell. It didn't sound like it was coming out right. It was also noteworthy that the ambassadors typically don't just pick up the phone and call presidents. They never do so to discuss Ukraine policy or whatever country they're in, I'm sure. Former U.S. Ambassador to Russia Michael McFaul said in a tweet, doing so on a cell phone from Kyiv means the whole world was listening in. That was pretty surprising. I was basically, this is another question that arose in my mind. Did Sondland initiate the call? Is that how it happened? Does that mean Sondland has Trump's personal number? It's not clear to me whether Trump was also on a cell phone. He may have called the office phone or not. But actually what occurred to me was that a few days ago, Trump was pulling his old routine, trying to distance himself from Sondland, as it looked like Sondland was starting to say things that were damaging to Trump. He said, I don't know him. I hardly know the guy. Maybe we may, I don't know, maybe we're in a picture or something. This is $1 million donor to his inauguration. And it makes a difference whether your $1 million goes to the campaign or an inauguration. Part of the difference is if it goes to the campaign, it has to go to a super PAC and it doesn't land in a place where Trump can directly pocket any of the money. But if you go to the inauguration, that was the real bribery fund, and it was, in my guess, that was a place where Trump had a lot more ability to actually withdraw giant chunks of that money or make up excuses to pay it to himself or to his wholly owned business entities as part of a contract or fee for services, and nobody would be any the wiser. So anyway, he's $1 million donor. I think they probably met. But he still says, I hardly know the guy. And yet, if he picks up the phone in a restaurant in Kyiv, even an unsecured phone, and calls the numbers that he somehow comes into possession of, he ends up, during lunch, he doesn't have to wait around very long or go through channels or anything. He just gets to talk to the president while he's at lunch at this restaurant. How does that phone call get picked up? You know? Like if somebody else screens it, if he calls through proper channels and they screen it and say, sir, it's your ambassador to the European Union. He's in Kyiv. And Trump would say, what's Kyiv? I don't understand. Kiev, right? In Ukraine. Oh, yes. Okay. And he wants to talk to you about the illegal things you want to do. Oh, okay. I'll put him through. Well, I mean, if you don't know the guy, right, then it's no, I'm busy, or I don't know that guy. Forget that. If it goes right to your phone and you pick it up, then even more obvious that you know the guy. I mean, it's a minor point. Nobody believes that he doesn't know him, but it's an interesting thing to think about if you're sifting through the evidence. All right. Russia already has shown its ability to monitor U.S. diplomats' calls in Kyiv, and the Kremlin has no hesitation in leaking them when it suits its interests. They can just give them to WikiLeaks like they did last time. In early 2014, an intercepted phone conversation between then Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Victoria Nuland, and then U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, appeared on YouTube. On the call, Nuland was heard referring dismissively to the slow-moving European Union efforts to address a looming political and economic crisis in Ukraine. F the EU, she said, although I guess she probably used the four-letter word that goes along. The other letters behind the F are the important ones, but that's interesting. F the EU, and U is one of them in there, the missing letters. So that just makes it sound even weirder and worse. She was also heard assessing the political skills of Ukrainian opposition figures with unusual candor. The leaked call was embarrassing to Washington and appeared to be an effort by Moscow to drive a wedge between the United States and the European Union. That would probably do some of it. The State Department acknowledged the call was authentic, and Nuland apologized to EU officials, but U.S. officials were also quick to blame Russia for the leak, describing it as a form of information warfare. Well, yeah, it was. But they're going to eavesdrop on you. Yeah, I don't remember that as being a really huge deal. But you know who would get a kick out of that? Jim Jordan. His whole shtick yesterday seemed to be, if I read the chain of how the information about the president's call came to the whistleblower really fast, it will have the opposite impact. Right? It will say the opposite thing. It implicates the president, but if I read it really fast, that Ambassador Sondland said that so-and-so told him, who told him, who told me, he recalled telling Ambassador Taylor that like he told two friends, and I know somebody who told me that Ferris Bueller has whatever it was. You remember that scene from the famous movie, unless you're not a boomer or whatever. But anyway, I don't see how that really had much impact. But he seemed to really think that reading it really quickly made it sound like it was super confusing. And it does, I mean, because you can't catch it. But if you actually slow down the sentence, you're like, okay, he told him that he thought that he said to this other person that that was the case. Okay, I understand that. That makes perfect sense. Thank you for slowing down. Anyway, so back to Victoria Nuland. She was also heard assessing the skills of various Ukrainian opposition figures with unusual candor, right? And then they blamed all this on the Russians. Calling a president from a cell phone violates protocols set up to protect senior administration officials' communications. Yes, it's indicative of a lack of concern for operational security, said a former senior U.S. intelligence official who spoke on condition of anonymity, which, whatever, okay. Senior officials, he said, are routinely briefed on the threats to their communications. You could assume that talking on an unencrypted line from a foreign country would be on that list. It's also dangerous for a president to take an off-the-books call like that, Pfeiffer said. That is why call logs are kept, he said. Without them, someone could assert that the president said something on a call, and the log protects the president's ability to deny something happened, he said. Good bureaucratic record-keeping is a protection for someone in the position of the president. That is a great point, actually mostly extraneous to this particular situation, although I don't know whether this was booked or not. But surely up until this point, Trump and even everybody else probably thought Trump was, because he's notorious for not keeping visitor logs. I don't know how he is about keeping phone logs, but I guess if he's taking off-the-books calls, then he doesn't have a log of every call he's making. He probably thinks he is effectively hiding information from people who could use it against him. But as it turns out, once again, this brings me back to the conversation I think that we had a couple of weeks ago about the importance and the necessity of protocols, of proper procedures and regular channels being used to conduct business, and how it's a protection for everybody. This too points out, look, the reason we log every phone call that the president has is so that nobody can say, oh, well, I talked to the president on the phone and he said the opposite, or he incriminated himself in some way. And I know because I was on the call. And if you weren't on the call, then you don't know. Well, if you log every call that the president takes, then you're able to go back there and say, you never called this person, or at least it wasn't at this time that this happened. And that's proof that the person is, likely making it up. Unless, of course, there was an off-the-books call. So again, ironically, Trump thinks he's protecting himself when he's in fact entrapping himself and giving his opponents the ability to make credible claims that these incriminating phone conversations took place, and now the logs are of no use to you in proving that they didn't take place. Check the tower logs, as they say. Well, what if you keep two sets or keep things off the books? It's a good point. This is not the first time questions have arisen over Trump's unorthodox phone use, of course. He's been known to give his personal cell phone number to other world leaders, despite aides' warnings that his cell phone calls are not secure. Russia and China, in particular, have targeted his personal cell phone calls, the New York Times reported. So, that's just out there. It's just true. In general, Trump has appeared unusually cavalier about operational security. One might speculate that that's the point, that he actually wants Vladimir Putin and others to know what he's up to as proof of his delivering on whatever end of the bargain there may be between the two of them. In February of 2017, at his Mar-a-Lago club in Palm Beach, on an open terrace in full view of other diners, Trump and Japan Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who's Abe Shinzo, and Japanese Prime Minister. But, well, how about that? Is that a new style book thing? Japan Prime Minister? Okay. Anyway, they had a sensitive discussion about how to respond to a ballistic missile test by North Korea. You all remember that as well. Okay. Oh, look, there's a correction at the bottom that says an earlier version of this story misspelled Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's first name. How do you know if you're misspelling a name that's transliterated from Cyrillic? That's an interesting question, because aren't we also misspelling his last name if he doesn't have the two Y's at the end? I don't know. Ukrainian is a mystery to me. Anyway, I just thought I'd bring you up to date on the security issues as well as fill in the background of what was said on the call. I didn't get information from this about who initiated the call, though, and I don't know if I have that correct or not. But if I come across some information that clarifies that, I will let you know. All right, let's see. There's also information we did learn the other day from coverage of the Roger Stone trial, which, by the way, is going to jury deliberations today, perhaps now as we speak. We learned that there was information offered by Gates in his testimony that makes it plain that either Roger Stone was lying in his answers to Mueller's investigators when he was questioned by them, or the president was lying in his written answers to questions posed to him, also in writing, by the Mueller investigators, or possibly both, but no possibility that neither of them were guilty of this. And that's interesting all by itself. But apparently, one extra twist in all of this, reported by Politico, the federal government's closing arguments yesterday, apparently laid out, not only did Roger Stone lie to investigators, but as a result, it must therefore be concluded that the House investigation, the House of Representatives' own investigation of the Trump-Russia situation, must have therefore been inaccurate because it relied to a great extent, for at least some of the information it presented, on Stone's answers. So Roger Stone's lies haven't just put him at risk of being sent to federal prison, as Politico puts it. They also caused lawmakers to produce an inaccurate report about Russian interference in the 2016 election. That's bad news because the whole record needs to be redone. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. All right, so I don't know if there's that much more to distill out of this. There's some interesting detail and comment on why Roger Stone may have been lying and what did he in fact lie about. But I'm not certain that that's the best use of our time, although I would like to. One day I have to turn around and get the record of this trial, although I think we're all just waiting for the big bombshell of what does the jury have to say. But certainly of some interest, I'll provide you the link to the piece you can read about in the background and try and catch up on these things. So let's see. They'll be beginning their jury deliberations today. Final pitch from the Assistant U.S. Attorney Jonathan Kravis yesterday, arguing, again, that Stone's attempts to mislead the House Intelligence Committee caused the panel to produce a factually incorrect report. And that's a bad thing. Stone not only tried, he succeeded in impeding the committee's investigation, Kravis said. The committee report is not accurate. The prosecutor pointed to where the House panel declared in its March 2018 report, that'd be a Republican report, that it, quote, did not find any evidence contradicting Stone's claim, unquote, that everything he said when boasting about the damage to Hillary Clinton's campaign came from publicly available information. No evidence? Really? Kravis said. How about that August 2nd email from Jerome Corsi? Well, you'd have to be up to speed on what actually happened in this case in order to make some particular sense of that apparently bombshell line. But, all right. I think we're probably better served by just noting that for the record and moving on to a couple other pieces. Changing directions slightly, except also at the same time establishing a pattern of bad conduct. Reporting at the Daily Beast by Spencer Ackerman and Erin Banco. Banco. Did you say Banco or Banco? I'll ask her in my spare time. She'll answer too. Here, news from the State Department. State Department punished staffer over Iranian heritage and politics. That's the conclusion of the much-delayed Office of Inspector General's, one of those again, inquiry into claims of political retaliation against State Department officials. What's this all about? Here we go. A long-awaited State Department watchdog report will find, I guess it did find, and we'll find out that it did find, that the Trump administration's point man on Iran, among other officials, retaliated against an agency employee in part because of her Iranian-American background, two knowledgeable sources told the Daily Beast. Now, if you want to find out about Iran, that's a combination of Iran and Iran put together, so we get both pronunciations in there, and everybody's happy. If you're the administration's point man on Iran, you will probably want to talk to people who understand Iran, and maybe an Iranian American who has agreed to sign up and work at the State Department with you would be a useful resource. But they might tell you something you don't like, and so therefore you have to get rid of them. The Daily Beast has previously reported that the State Department Inspector General's office was prepared to suggest disciplinary action for, I'll give him the honorific title of Captain, Brian Hook, because that would make him Captain Hook. We're waiting for that. For political retaliation against employees in his policy planning office, including a career department official and Iran expert. Oh my goodness. Sahar, no W now, Rosada. Now Rosada, how about that? Nowrouzadeh, another transliteration that we're unlikely to get exactly right. But how do we say it? Nowrouzadeh. All right, try and remember that because it'll come up again. But the Inspector General's report, set for release on Thursday, that's today too, in between the first two public hearings in the impeachment of the president, found out that top State Department officials, including Hook, easy to pronounce, retaliated against Nowrouzadeh, not that easy, in part because she is Iranian. Well, Iranian-American, geez. Politico first reported that finding, and I think we heard about that at the time. The allegation derives from a cache of emails that show officials within Hook's policy planning office and other departments talking about Nowrouzadeh's background ahead of the premature end of her detail to the prestigious office. Some of those emails, previously reported by the Daily Beast, described Nowrouzadeh as being among Obama/Clinton loyalists, not at all supportive of President Trump's agenda, and one official falsely suggests that Nowrouzadeh was born in Iran. Oh no, not that. Well, anyway, very interesting too. By the way, it may very well be the case. Did that make sense? Was that intelligible? It may very well be the case that Nowrouzadeh is an Obama-Clinton loyalist and not at all supportive of President Trump's agenda. But the question really is, well, does she know anything about Iran? Because Iran is probably not, they wouldn't consider themselves Obama-Clinton loyalists, to be sure, but they're not at all supportive of President Trump's agenda. So what's the difference? If the not at all supportive Iranians have their intentions interpreted through an honest broker who just also has no support for President Trump's agenda, it's not likely to get distorted. Unless, I guess, if they're not an honest broker, in which case you give them information that says, oh, you should absolutely, for instance, I don't know, get involved in a war immediately. Although that's what they would want to hear. So stay out of the wars. Don't fight Iran at all. I don't know. Anyway, Hook has vociferously denied retaliating in 2017 against Nowrouzadeh based on her heritage. It was just I hated her for other regular reasons, I guess. Neither Hook nor the State Department immediately responded to a request for comment. The State Department's IG office has for months held on to its report for final review before sending it to Capitol Hill. Two individuals with knowledge of the report's drafting told the Daily Beast that the report was originally due for public release sometime over the summer. The IG's office, they were wrapped up in a little bit of other stuff, I guess. The IG's office picked up the investigation into Hook and other State Department officials for their perceived political retaliation after multiple whistleblowers approached lawmakers on the Hill about their experiences while working on the policy planning team under Hook. So, very much a pattern of behavior. Lots of political retaliation going on there. Lots of people who have whistleblower complaints. And what do you know? They're about the State Department in many cases. So, very interesting that this happens to be going on right at the time where we're investigating similar claims in impeachment hearings. All right, we'll keep things brief there. This is another lengthy article that I feel like I'm giving short shrift to, but only because of the number of other things that we have to get to. That reminds me, by the way, to a story. There's a story that we skipped that I think Justice covered at some point, but we really should put on the record here that we're aware of it. We're just not up to speed on it. Scrolling back down through Pocket, I'll see if I can't find it. But yes, here we go. The story of the report over in the UK about Russian interference in the Brexit campaign. That report has been prepared by the British government and was, at least for a time, suppressed by Boris Johnson's office, as he has assumed the office of Prime Minister there. And this was the source of a lot of tension over there. I don't know exactly where we are on this one, but back on November 10th, I think is the last report that I've got on it. Business Insider gave us this report here. Boris Johnson's Conservative Party has received cash from 9 Russian donors named in a suppressed intelligence report. So sort of an oblique approach to getting you the news, covering the news, mentioning the news of the suppression of this support. It's caused more problems and raised more suspicions now that we find out from some other source that Boris Johnson's Conservatives have received cash from 9 Russian donors, probably a no-no even under British law, who were named in this suppressed report, which perhaps gives us reason to guess at why the report was suppressed in the first place. Maybe we save time here by reading the customary handy bullet points that are included by Business Insider up at the top of the article, which I think probably honestly has the effect on a lot of people of causing them not to read the article. I'm guessing that the authors of the articles are not happy about having those things, but it saves us some time. Let's use it. Boris Johnson's Conservative Party has received donations from 9 Russian donors with suspected links to the Kremlin, according to an official report which has been suppressed by the Prime Minister, and I guess was still being suppressed as of the 10th anyway. Johnson chose to block publication of the report amid reported fears it could cost him the upcoming general election. Leaked details from the report tied Johnson's party to London-based Russian oligarchs, some of whom have known ties to the Russian security services, and there has been a surge in donations from prominent Russians to the Conservative Party over the past year. No detail in the bullet points about whether or not that is unlawful in British elections. I have questions about that. Are we able to find that out without getting bogged down in the article? Not really entirely sure. They've got some names we could share of the 9 Russians, or at least some number of them, and how much money that they're donating and who's getting it. But it not being U.S. domestic politics, it might not make a great deal of sense. However, for our, let's say for our UK listeners or UK adjacent listeners, perhaps we ought to share all this. Boris Johnson's Conservative Party has received a surge in cash from 9 Russian donors named in this suppressed investigation. And the investigation was, of course, remember, into Russia's attempts to undermine democracy in the UK. The report by Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee identifies close links between major donors to the Conservative Party and the Russian government. The Sunday Times reports, if you were looking for the original source there. The report was due for publication this week, that would have been last week, but blocked by Johnson due to reported fears that the information would damage his chances of winning the upcoming election. Is that a legit reason for blocking things? No. Among the donors named in the suppressed report are Alexander Temerko, who worked for the Russian Defense Ministry and has previously boasted that the Prime Minister is his friend. Temerko donated more than £1.2 million to the Conservatives over the past 7 years. Other Russian donors to the Conservative Party included Lyubov Chernukin, who's married to Vladimir Chernukin, a former ally of Putin. Chernukin previously paid £160,000 for a tennis match with Johnson, really, and former Prime Minister David Cameron, and has donated more than £450,000 in the past year. The committee also reportedly heard concerns about the former Russian spy Alexander Lebedev, who owns the Evening Standard and independent newspapers. Oh, okay. So he's a former Russian spy who owns two UK newspapers. No big deal. Lebedev is not a donor to the Conservative Party. However, his son Evgeny is a close friend of the Prime Minister and has repeatedly hosted him for parties at his castle in Perugia, Italy, while Johnson was mayor of London and foreign secretary. Concerns were raised about Johnson's decision to attend the events, in which guests have reported that, quote, nothing is off the menu from the moment you are greeted to the moment you leave, which I guess is meant to mean they're not talking about food necessarily. Fears have previously been raised that Johnson's private life may make him a security risk due to the possibility he could be blackmailed, although what would he be embarrassed about? I'm not sure. I get this report, though. I guess he should have released the report and say, I'm not embarrassed about anything. You can't blackmail me. Much more Trumpish he could be. There's the danger that people leak what they have over him or blackmail him with it, a cabinet minister in Theresa May's government told the Sunday Times earlier this year. The opposition Labour Party accused Johnson of seeking to cover up the revelations. Well, he's doing it now. The Tories blocked this report and opposed tax transparency, so their billionaire backers can continue to rip us off unchallenged, Labour's election coordinator Andrew Gwynn said. Labour is on the side of the many, not the few, so we'll get dirty money out of politics, introduce an oligarch levy, and take on the vested interests selling out our people in public services. Well, we'll see about that. A Conservative Party spokesman said, we cannot speculate on what may or may not be in a leaked parliamentary report. Oh, sure we can. Well, we wouldn't have to speculate if it was leaked. So, that's weird. Sources who have seen the report told the Times they believe the report has been suppressed because it highlights extensive connections between conservative donors and Russia's Federal Security Bureau. What makes it interesting is just how close some of these people are to the FSB, or have been, one source told the paper. An investigation by Open Democracy this week found that the Conservative Party received at least £498,850, or about $642,000, from Russian business executives and their associates between November 2018 and last month. This was a significant increase from the previous year when such donations amounted to less than £350,000. The increase came despite increased pressure on the party to cut its ties to Russian oligarchs since the poisoning of Sergei and Yulia Skripal in Salisbury last year. It doesn't sound like it's illegal in itself, I guess. The news also comes as Johnson's chief strategist, Dominic Cummings, is under the spotlight after the Sunday Times reported claims from a whistleblower about serious concerns about the time he spent in Russia in the 1990s. Cummings has reportedly had his access to intelligence restricted by UK authorities despite his senior position. Interesting. They're ahead of us on that curve. Labour MP Ben Bradshaw told the Sydney Morning Herald this week that this unprecedented arrangement was a concern for Britain's security relations with other countries. If I were one of the UK's Five Eyes allies, I would be extremely concerned about this unprecedented arrangement, Bradshaw said. Boris Johnson's chief of staff, whose account of his time in Russia is apparently full of gaps and inaccuracies, is granted inexplicably the highest level of security clearance, yet is not given full access to secret intelligence. That is interesting, isn't it? All right. What's not clear to me, even after reading the article, is are we talking about the donations of Russians, connected Russians who are now British citizens, or are they still not British citizens and donating money, but that's not illegal in the UK? I'm not entirely sure about that, and I guess we'll have to seek clarification from other sources, including those of you in the UK who may know what the answer is. And who knows? Maybe even people in the UK don't know the answer. All right. So we have that to add to the mix. Now back up, to the top of the Pocket News Roundup. where shall we go next? This certainly needs some mention. I happened to see a brief mention of this go by this morning through Tegan Goddard's Political Wire's Twitter account. And I thought that perhaps we should spend some time on this one. I've got to get rid of this pop-up over at The Guardian. Another excerpt out of the anonymous book, A Warning, about the way the Trump administration works, and similar to other splashy book excerpts, another thing that I assume was overheard by someone, either the author of the book or someone who spoke to the author of the book as a source, that will be no doubt denied. Well, do you think Trump will deny this one? I don't know. Trump proposed sending migrants to Guantanamo, claims book by anonymous author. Donald Trump proposed designating all migrants entering the U.S. without permission as enemy combatants, which is the only way legally that you could land them in Guantanamo. But I say that and remind you to take it with a grain of salt, because why wouldn't I'm surprised actually that the president would bother proposing that. Like if he said, not that, I'm surprised that he would propose they be put in Guantanamo. There's not enough room in Guantanamo, and it's totally inappropriate to put them in Guantanamo, to house them in Guantanamo, even temporarily. But it wouldn't surprise me that he would come up with that as a solution. What surprises me is that someone would say, well, Guantanamo is for enemy combatants. You can't get put in Guantanamo unless you're designated an enemy combatant. And at that point, it wouldn't surprise me then for Trump to say, all right, well, we'll just designate them enemy combatants then and put them there. And this raises a number of concerns, not the least of which is, why is President Trump so dumb? But in addition, the concern that dates to the establishment of the prison camp in Guantanamo, and the whole idea that at the time of giving George W. Bush that authority and saying, well, who are we going to put in this Guantanamo camp? We'll put enemy combatants there. Who are enemy combatants? Well, essentially at bottom there, whoever the president designates them to be. And that's just one of the powers that will grant the presidency in this robust era of unlimited, virtually unlimited presidential powers and the unitary executive, etc. And many of us protested at the time. You're just going to say that the president unilaterally, particularly this very dumb and to that point possibly dumbest in history president, George W. Bush, can just say someone is an enemy combatant? Well, there are processes through which you can protest and challenge your designation, but they may not be open to inspection. They may be military courts, which are not open to inspection the same way that civilian courts are, but there'll be a process. And for most of the judges in the federal judiciary, that actually ended up being enough, and it was very dangerous. Just saying, at the time, just saying George W. Bush, who was in the middle of politicizing the Justice Department, and who knows what other departments as well. We only got real clear detail on the Justice Department politicization, but if he was going to do that, politicizing the Justice Department, totally beyond the pale, outrageous. Well, would he, though, go so far as to say, well, my political enemies will just be designated enemy combatants and put in Guantanamo? That's the ultimate fear, of course. But I think by the end, we got the sense that even the politicizing idiots in the George W. Bush administration understood what sort of firestorm they would start by taking people who are obviously not enemy combatants, but are annoyances, political annoyances for the George W. Bush administration, and labeling them enemy combatants and putting them in Guantanamo. Now, we may, in hindsight, have, at this point, some of us listening to the show may even wish that it had happened. For instance, what if Glenn Greenwald had been labeled an enemy combatant and stuck in Guantanamo? Now, that would have been bad. We don't cheer for that. And I still listen from time to time. I haven't muted him in Twitter, for instance, because it's like, well, every once in a while he breaks through with something that I say, all right, well, that should weigh on my conscience a little bit. But for the most part, he's lost his impact with me, as he has with a lot of you, I'm sure. But that would, I think, we would universally agree as good progressives that it would have been bad to simply designate Glenn Greenwald an enemy combatant at that time and put him in Guantanamo. But that was the fear. And then, we mostly made it out of the George W. Bush era in a condition wherein most mainstream traditional news commentators would have said, oh, come on now, to the suggestion that the president could simply designate his enemies as enemy combatants and stick them in Guantanamo. But then Donald Trump came along. And now I think even your mainstream traditional news commentators would probably not feel entirely comfortable adopting the position that no, there's no way that President Trump would exercise this authority in this fashion. He would not simply designate people enemy combatants out of nowhere and stick them in Guantanamo because he doesn't like them. And it's still the case that most people would say, well, he's not going to do that to Joe Biden, for instance, or Hillary Clinton, for that matter. Although he certainly could have, I guess, under the broad reading of the powers that we protested was a possibility in the Bush administration. And then it was, of course, still a possibility in the Obama administration. But fewer people felt that Obama would so abuse the power than thought W might. And I think probably the rate has doubled, tripled, quadrupled when it comes to the number of people who suspect that maybe Donald Trump would do something quite this dumb. But he would do it to a group of people that are largely anonymous and have not got widespread, it doesn't have the same number of eyes on them and don't have the widespread political report. Like, for instance, saying Hillary Clinton is an enemy combatant, she's going to Guantanamo, would raise certain hackles. Different hackles might be raised, in fact, by designating ordinary, undocumented immigrants as enemy combatants, but without the name, the face, the fame, etc., to link to, it might just work. That might be something that they get away with. But it would make for an interesting conversation to have witnessed inside the Bush administration, or not the Bush, but the Trump administration. Does Trump mean it? He'll deny it if it looks bad for him, and I'm not certain whether he thinks it does look bad for him. His fans probably love the idea. So, where were we with this? Among the many incendiary details contained in A Warning, that's the anonymous book, is the revelation that the president floated the idea of changing the legal designation of migrants as a way of forcibly keeping them out of the country. The change would effectively have condemned all undocumented migrants to the same legal treatment as the Al-Qaeda architects of 9/11. Too far-fetched? Maybe, but how often have they said, well, this is a war, these migrants are invading the United States, where this is we should be invoking emergency powers to repel invasion. High-ranking members of the Trump administration have said as much. The author of A Warning shot to public notice in September of 2018 when he or she wrote an article in the New York Times. I didn't actually realize it was the same person, but it makes sense. I just thought we all forgot about the article in the New York Times. The column presented its author as part of an internal resistance to Trump, trying to frustrate his most extreme ambitions. In the new book, which The Guardian obtained in advance of publication next week, Anonymous puts flesh on the bones of some such harebrained schemes. There we are. The migrant plan, the author writes, stemmed from Trump's unfounded conviction that unlawful migration across the border with Mexico was, quote, the biggest crisis in American history. When his proposed solution of labeling all undocumented migrants enemy combatants began to circulate around the administration, it provoked astonishment and mortification. The author writes, are you effing kidding me? This is completely bat-s, or guano if you prefer. An unnamed State Department official is quoted as saying. That's about how I would imagine they would react. Trump signed an executive order to keep Guantanamo Bay open as a prison camp in January of 2018, reversing Barack Obama's policy of closing it, which he didn't actually get anywhere with, and so not worth really reversing, but another one of those show signature situations more than anything else. But let's see. Earlier this year it was reported that at the height of the detention crunch over unaccompanied minors crossing the southern border, Department of Homeland Security officials explored the possibility of sending some migrant children to Guantanamo. That would be even worse. Wow. But a warning suggests that Trump wanted to go much further, applying the enemy combatant label to all undocumented migrants as deterrence. They wanted to start with the kids. I don't see how that's not worse. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday, but our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I guess we can skimmed over the rest of this article. There's some interesting stuff in there, but it takes us pretty far afield. Plus, it requires the pronunciation of the names of ancient Greeks and Romans, and that's going to be difficult and not exactly on point. But we'll say good summation of things here, just sort of pointing out enemy combatants was the legal definition that the Bush administration seized upon as a way of skirting international law to justify indefinitely detaining al-Qaeda and Taliban suspects picked up in the so-called War on Terror after 9/11. Its use to bypass federal courts and hold terrorist suspects in the extrajudicial military setting of the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo was condemned around the world. Using the same designation for undocumented migrants would have taken the concept to another level entirely. As Anonymous points out, migrants are neither enemies nor combatants, as they are not engaged in hostilities against the U.S. Hardcore Trump administration supporters inside the administration and without would, in fact, look you right in the eye and tell you that's not true. They are engaged in hostilities against the United States. It's a mass invasion, and they really ought to be considered enemy combatants. I mean, I hate to both sides. I'm just saying there are lunatics who believe this stuff, who are in positions of power in the United States government, some of whom may have the ability themselves to push such a policy. Or what's worse is, of course, there's a lunatic who's the president of the United States who undoubtedly, under the theory established during the Bush administration, has the authority, almost unilaterally, if not completely unilaterally, to make this designation after all, and to actually put it in practice. And we'll be standing there looking at one another and saying, we all thought that that was something that was beyond the pale. It was okay to leave this policy open-ended because no president would be idiotic enough to blow past all bounds of reason here and simply designate, for that matter, not only undocumented migrants, but for that matter, Hillary Clinton or Hunter Biden or Joe Biden or you listening to this show, an enemy combatant. No one would do that, unless, of course, you mean the person who would do that, who also happens to be president of the United States. Just sort of object lesson in not doing that stuff in the first place. Or when you succeed such a president with the opposite view and are warned that something really needs to be done to pull up those tracks laid by the previous president and designate them as clearly unacceptable, illegal, impeachable, etc., prosecutable, in fact, that you ought to do so with the newfound power and opportunity that you've been afforded by your election to office, so that the next crazy-ass Republican president doesn't do that or 10 times worse. Like, let's say, Donald Trump succeeds you in office. At that time, of course, we probably couldn't tell that he would do these things. Not only that he would succeed him in office, but be as crazy as he turned out to be. We didn't find that out until about 2014, 15. But, well, just one of those situations where it would have paid to tear up those tracks so that they weren't available for use by the Trump train to carry on that metaphor. Anyway, where were we with this? Yes. The author calls the idea morally offensive and truly insane on its face for America to send migrant children and families to a terrorist prison in Cuba. Yes, true. But okay, good summation. We're done with that one and can move on to a couple of the other items socked away in pocket. Let's see. Skipping forward. Yes, here we are. Something that I picked up on from The Hill yesterday, and in chorus, many of you saying, don't read from The Hill. It's garbage. Yes, it is. And perhaps that can be our transition. We can spend part of our last segment on reminding everybody just how terrible The Hill has been and can be. But there are some things for which I trust them as a source, despite the John Solomon situation, which is, I guess, what we'll get to next. This from Alexander Bolton. He, generally speaking, tends to be more or less straightforward in his reporting, and very often we call his name because he covers some of these procedural issues. Senate GOP, or GOP, as we like to say, waves Trump off early motion to dismiss impeachment charges. We speculated this might be the case, that they might consider some sort of expedited procedure that is basically not much in the way of a trial and holds an immediate vote on, okay, we acknowledge having received the House's articles of impeachment, we will just move directly to a party line vote to exonerate him, to refuse to convict, and then simply jettison the rest. Senate Republicans are telling President Trump's defense team to prepare for a full Senate trial, stating that any motion for an early dismissal of impeachment charges likely won't have the votes to pass. Interesting. The warnings are a tacit acknowledgement that it would be politically risky to simply discard articles of impeachment, even though all Senate Republicans may ultimately opt to acquit the president. Senator John Cornyn, of Texas, of course, an advisor to the Senate GOP leadership, and a member of the Senate Judiciary and Intelligence Committees, on Wednesday said a vote to immediately dismiss articles of impeachment and avoid a trial won't work. There's some people talking about trying to stop the bill, dismiss charges, basically, as soon as they get over here. I think that's not going to happen. That would require 51 votes. True. Cornyn told reporters Wednesday. That doesn't dissuade anybody from believing that you could get it, though. I think it would be hard to find 51 votes to cut the case off before the evidence is presented. But I see his point, and I think he may be right about that. There will be some senators who are particularly sensitive about that, who will say, how do we contend logically that the evidence actually points to the need to exonerate the president, to clear him of these charges, to refuse to remove him from office, if we insist that the evidence shows that this is unwarranted, why would we be afraid of airing the evidence? True, that's a good logical point, but that also, assumes that they're interested in logic, which is not always the case. Let's continue with the reading. Senator Rand Paul, a staunch Trump ally, is one Republican senator said to be thinking about advancing a motion to dismiss the articles of impeachment, even though it is likely to fall well short of the 51 votes needed to pass. He doesn't mind doing that. A spokesman for Paul on Wednesday declined to comment. McConnell told GOP colleagues during a lunch meeting last month that any motion to dismiss would be reserved for the impeachment manager and the president's defense team. During former President Clinton's 1999 Senate trial, The late Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia offered a motion to dismiss the articles of impeachment, but it failed by a vote of 44 to 56. Every single Democrat, except for then Senator Russ Feingold, voted for the motion to dismiss. Interesting note. Senate Republicans, even though they control 53 seats, don't think there would be enough unity within their conference to dismiss charges against Trump before the prosecutors and defense have a chance to lay out their arguments and senators have a chance to ask questions and deliberate. That too. Not likely that senators would give up the opportunity to grandstand in defense of Trump. Senator Mike Braun of Indiana, I don't even think I know who that guy is, said he wants a sense of closure that would come from a full trial that results in an up or down vote on whether to convict or acquit the president on the charges. I think that if it does come over to the Senate, that we should offer due process to the whole journey. That would be an awfully embarrassing thing, of course, to deny the due process. Where that hasn't been done coming to this point, he said, noting that his GOP colleagues, GOP colleagues, want to provide a counterpoint to what they see as the partisan House proceedings. It's not wise, but I can understand why they want to do that. Brown, how does he even say that? B-R-A-U-N, said passing a motion to immediately dismiss articles of impeachment would be probably the wrong thing to do because it would not clear the slate of allegations against the president. My opinion would be that we've come this far and it probably ought to be heard, he said. Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma said, I think we should go through with the process. Cornyn stated that the better course would be to let each side have their say and then have the Senate vote and see if they can meet the two-thirds threshold to convict the president on impeachment articles. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell told the reporters that he has no plans to avoid a trial. I don't think there's any question that we have to take up the matter. The rules of impeachment are very clear. We'll have to have a trial, said McConnell, who was similarly critical of the motion to dismiss Clinton's 1999 impeachment trial. My own view is that we should give people an opportunity to put the case on. The House will have presenters. The president will no doubt be represented by lawyers as well, he added. Senate Republican Whip John Thune, South Dakota, said people want to fulfill their constitutional responsibility. We would have to do what the Constitution calls for the Senate to do, and that is to hear the arguments, to listen, and to take it seriously. Too bad about Lindsey Graham, though. He says he won't do that. My guess would be that our members are going to want, I think, to at least move forward, he added. The consensus in our conference is that at least we need to proceed and take seriously the responsibility we have under the Constitution. All right, I know, it's good to hear. And I understand the idea, why you would want to throw that out there. Red meat for the base. Rand Paul may even want to actually offer this up, but I think you get the gist of things. Just thought I would bring up the fact that people are talking about it and that McConnell's wing, which is usually the controlling wing of the Republican conference there in the Senate, is not particularly interested. Maybe from here, did we move on to John Solomon, if I can find it? Let's take a look. I think I've got, is this a tweet that has a link to a story, or is this just a mislabeled story that says it's only brief enough to read in 1 minute? No, I think it's the full story. All right. Told you about, I mentioned John Solomon. And I don't know, we probably did eventually read the story of how he was in that awkward position of mixing the business side of the Hill with the editorial side, or the news side, and they moved him into being an opinion, quote unquote, an opinion writer. And I feel like there was another development in between that we haven't read, but is my quick scan of Pocket likely to turn it up? No. But, here we are. There was this other entry here. Let me see. How long is this? Something from Just Security. Sidney Blumenthal, is that right? Writing for Just Security with a dozen questions for John Solomon. How long does it take to get through the dozen questions? One wonders. But maybe we can pose those and take a look also at the Daily Beast's Casey Michaels report on what's happening now with, well, I guess this actually goes back a while. It's from October, so it comes first in time here. So maybe we'll just give you the headline of what's up with him now. Water finds its level as Fox News hires dictator-loving, deep state-loathing John Solomon. Journalism's leading conspiracy theorist has finally found his natural home, Fox News. But he was a fact masseuse long before Trump came along. How interesting. So interesting background on Solomon being offered there. And then when was the just security piece, the dozen questions? That was November 5th. So I guess it comes second in time. Maybe we'll go then to the Daily Beast backgrounder here. I think that might be the more informative for our purposes about John Solomon. And it's about time that we got used to hearing his name too. At some point he has to get pulled into all of this. So an early prediction on that, that things will escalate perhaps for John Solomon. Over the weekend, and this is written back on October 14th, 13th in fact, but updated on the 14th, this Casey Michael piece in the Daily Beast. So back over that weekend, whatever it was, Fox News announced that it had made a new hire, John Solomon, the self-proclaimed journalist, that's kind of funny, at the heart of the unfolding scandal involving Ukraine, Rudy Giuliani, and the impending impeachment of Donald Trump. That now underway, of course. It's not hard to see why Fox executives may have wanted to bring him aboard. Solomon's work has underpinned the entire cascade of lies the White House and Trump, in particular, have pushed over the past few weeks. Solomon's writings, including those most recently at The Hill, where he worked until last month, are drenched in innuendo and mischaracterizations, all in service of attacking Trump's political opponents. Solomon is already a regular Fox News fixture. He appeared on Fox News' The Story show last week to claim that he was being victimized by McCarthy-like attacks. As Mother Jones noted on Solomon's hiring, which coincided with Giuliani claiming that the man deserves a Pulitzer, Solomon's alliance with pro-Trump forces is now official. For many, Solomon remains far from a household name. I guess that's the point of all this, right? A relatively obscure journalist who worked until recently at a relatively obscure outlet, pushing relatively obscure stories about relatively obscure countries. And if you read that really fast, a la Jim Jordan, it's apparently supposed to be damning to the Fox News crowd. But for those who followed his work, which includes a long-ago stint at Newsweek and the Daily Beast, his role in the entire unfolding national nightmare and the fact that he provided a willing platform to lies and half-truths coming out of Ukraine wasn't a surprise. This is a man, after all, about whom the Columbia Journalism Review wrote not one, not two, but three separate takedowns. One headline, they note, John Solomon gives us less than meets the eye again. The most recent, topped out at nearly 5,000 words, highlighting Solomon's history of bending the truth to his storyline, as well as his hyping of petty stories and his outsized habit of massaging facts to conjure fandom scandals. Complaints from colleagues tailed Solomon wherever he went, and as one former co-worker said about Solomon's work, facts be damned. Small wonder that the Daily Beast reported last week staffers at The Hill were enraged by his presence at the publication. But there was one kind of friend on whom Solomon could always count, and who could always count on Solomon's support in return, post-Soviet officials, oligarchs, and lobbyists looking to launder their image and spin their narrative. We've seen this most clearly over the past few months, as Solomon's coverage of Ukraine has gained a national audience and completely fallen apart under the most basic scrutiny. To take one example, Solomon's writing lent credence to the notion that the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, had given a Ukrainian prosecutor a do not prosecute list. One problem, there's no evidence the list ever existed. And the prosecutor himself eventually walked back the claim entirely. But the damage was already done. The White House this year canned the ambassador, who's since been personally targeted by Trump as some kind of henchman in former Vice President Joe Biden's machinations. For good measure, Solomon this weekend described Ukraine's successful 2014 revolution to oust corrupt strongman Viktor Yanukovych as a coup. But Ukraine was far from the only post-Soviet state where crooked actors and dirty money looked for and found help from Solomon. A couple of years ago, while I was a graduate student at Columbia University's Harriman Institute, focusing on post-Soviet affairs, I patched together a master's thesis on how post-Soviet kleptocrats whitewash their reputations for American audiences. And there, in the middle of a lobbyist-led campaign to clean up the image of Azerbaijan, one of the most heinous, most kleptocratic governments in the world, sat none other than John Solomon. In 2015, Solomon was an editor at the Washington Times. His tenure there just so happened to coincide with the paper becoming one of the go-to outlets for Azerbaijan's lobbyists to lie about the brutal Azeri regime's supposed graces, including pieces that failed to disclose that the authors were on the Azeri dole, like one column by former GOP congressman, remember him, Dan Burton, who written while he was lobbying for Azerbaijan. Solomon took some responsibility in that case when contacted by the Washington Post, claiming the lack of disclosure was just an oversight. And when I spoke with Solomon in the context of my research, telling him that one of the pieces which claimed that, quote, few places in the world are as welcoming to Americans as Azerbaijan, still didn't note it was written by a pro-Azeri lobbyist, he told me that he'd add the disclaimer in. But 4 years later, the article remains unchanged, and anyone reading it would think the author was simply interested in the pleasures and pastimes of Azerbaijan, and not that he was a paid-off hack. In the years since, I, like many familiar with his work, have looked askance at anything that Solomon has published, never taking it at face value, and rightfully so, as we've recently seen out of Ukraine. Solomon is still massaging facts, and he's still conjuring phantom scandals, and now he's been hired by Fox News for his efforts. And federal filings may provide a hint of who Solomon might help whitewash next. According to documents filed with the Department of Justice's Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA, right? According to that database, Solomon's 2015 push to include a raft of pro-Azeri material in the Washington Times just so happened to coincide with his meetings with Azeri lobbyists. The subject of those 2015 meetings, Azerbaijan public relations. That's how it was logged. Fast forward to 2019, and as FARA further outlines, Solomon was also in contact with Lanny Davis, a man who, until recently, was working on behalf of Ukrainian oligarch Dmytro Firtash. Of course, he got replaced by Digenova and Tensing, who are making the rounds in Twitter this morning in a empty wheel tweet, if you may have seen that one. Accused by American authorities of massive bribery and described by the DOJ as an alleged upper echelon associate of Russian organized crime, Firtash is currently fighting extradition from Austria to the United States. For help, Firtash recently hired conspiratorial pro-Trump lawyers Tensing and Digenova, both of whom have joined Giuliani in working to dig up Ukrainian dirt on Biden. Firtash also just happens to publicly loathe Biden. We know that much. There are no FARA filings yet listed on any communications between Tensing, Digenova, and Solomon, but we already know that Solomon was emailing at least some of his stories before publication at The Hill to Tensing and Digenova, as well as to Lev Parnas, the now arrested bagman and associate of Giuliani, who also happens to be working for Firtash. So if you see Solomon, whom Politico recently described as an ally of the two lawyers, beginning to spin Firtash as some kind of wronged businessman, someone unfairly targeted by the Obama administration perhaps, don't be surprised. After all, something like that would fit squarely within Solomon's track as a kleptocrat's favorite spin man, no matter the cost and no matter the consequences. So I think that clarifies things a little bit on him. What about the dozen questions that Sidney Blumenthal might ask him? In what context? I don't know. Let's find out. See if we can squeeze in some of that. President Donald Trump's attempt to force the government of Ukraine to investigate former Vice President Joe Biden was launched through a disinformation campaign whose first and chief propagator was John Solomon, a conservative columnist with a pattern of publishing false and misleading stories. So I guess insofar as the Republicans would want the various investigations all to include investigations of how did this investigation begin and was it on the up and up, we can ask ourselves, all right, well, might it make a good area of inquiry or even a fair trade if you wanted to both sides things to inquire about the origins of the Ukraine theory? It might. Continuing on here, Solomon's work, according to the Washington Post, has played an important role in advancing a flawed, Trump-friendly tale of corruption in Ukraine. Some background on his history here. Began as a reporter for AP, subsequently bounced around in right-wing media from the Washington Times to a website called Circa News, owned by Sinclair Media and now defunct. Oh, I can get rid of that app. In 2012, the Columbia Journalism Review concluded that Solomon has a history of bending the truth to his storyline and distorting facts and hyping petty stories. We heard most of that in the backgrounder here. Starting in March of this year, Solomon's articles in The Hill and his tweets spun out a web of conspiracy theories, in some cases then tweeted by Trump, that parts of the Ukrainian government, in coordination with U.S. Ambassador to the Ukraine, Yovanovitch, colluded to help Hillary Clinton's campaign by leaking financial records of Paul Manafort. You know about that, the Black Ledger, right? The U.S. ambassador had pressured Ukraine and their prosecutor not to investigate a George Soros-backed group and Soros-connected names. That's the list. This is the do not prosecute list. This gives us the additional detail that Solomon hinted that there was Soros connections, all of these names. That's why you can't prosecute them. And who helped the Clinton campaign in its alleged scheme, and that the ambassador told the prosecutor not to investigate this list of individuals, etc., etc. More familiar stuff, Hunter Biden, Burisma, etc. Solomon depicted a second innocent victim in these conspiracies, in addition to Trump, Ukrainian oligarch Dmitry Firtash, a major target of the Soros group, he said. Firtash, close to Russian President Vladimir Putin and Russian mafia kingpin Semyon Mogilevich, and chief financier of former Ukrainian President Yanukovych, and by the way, chief antagonist of the previous Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, who comes up in all these things because I think it's important, is fighting extradition, as you know. Solomon wrote that Robert Mueller's investigation was attempting to frame Firtash to get some dirt on Donald Trump, but that the case against Firtash was falling apart, Solomon stated. The oligarch's defense team told me that Firtash rejected the deal, Solomon said, because he didn't have credible information or evidence. The State Department labeled the charges in Solomon's initial article about Yovanovitch as an outright fabrication. Later, the Ukrainian prosecutor Solomon quoted as his source, Yuri Lutsenko, was dismissed from his position and disavowed Solomon's reporting, saying Hunter Biden did not violate anything, and now said that his statements to Solomon were not, about a do not prosecute list were false. All right, so most of this stuff we already know. A couple of additional nuggets I think we'll risk missing to skip down and see what some of these questions are. The setup here: in recent weeks, Trump, Hannity, and Giuliani have all proclaimed that Solomon deserves a Pulitzer Prize. Many questions about Solomon's part in the disinformation operation remain unanswered, and here are a few. And there are several, and we're not going to get through all of them. But maybe there's some interesting ones. We'll pose them and see if there aren't some answers before moving on to what comes next. First, did you ever take money or benefit directly or indirectly from Dmitry Firtash? Did Digenova and Tensing introduce you to Firtash to serve as your source? Was it before they formally became his attorneys? That would be an interesting question. To whom and how much did Firtash pay to generate and circulate the disinformation that you published? Well, we'd have to do a little work in establishing all of that first, of course. And that was just the first question. Can you believe it? Let's just throw the second one in here at the very least. Oops, we got the wrong music rolling. We need this one instead. Surprise, we're not going into another break. How much did you pay Parnas? Was it your own money? Whose money was it? Was your employment or use of Parnas arranged by Digenova and Tensing? Explain the involvement of your attorneys in the full range of your transactions with Parnas. You may recall, there may have been a reminder in the part we skipped, that he used Parnas to translate in his interview of Firtash, right? Number 3, when did you hire DeGenova and Tensing as your attorneys, and for what matters? How much have you paid them? Over how long a period of time? And for which specific services? Number 4, how many articles have you written that included information provided from sources that you knew to be clients of your lawyers, DeGenova and Tensing, and on what topics? I think that's actually an important connection. Maybe we'll get to... Well, let's leave off from here, because really what's most important at this point is that we let you know what's coming up next on Justice Putnam's program, the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, all the stuff that we may have missed. Let's see, what might that include? How about this? The student body president at the University of Florida faces impeachment over bribing Don Jr. to visit with a $50,000 student fee. How about that? Or paid with student monies. Trump's plan to use a webcam at the border could backfire spectacularly by revealing U.S. work crews continuously
From Daily Co's Radio,
violating Mexican sovereignty.
NetworksRadio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Yes, I heard about that story. They wanted to use webcams, I guess, to show progress on the wall being built. I don't know whether it's actually ever going to show that. I'd like to show up with a sign and maybe see if I can't get on camera. But keep an eye on that story and many more coming up here next, right here on Netroots Radio with Justice Putnam. We'll see you again tomorrow.